The sun was low, throwing long shadows over the dusty streets of Dry Creek when Jed Matthews rode into town. He wasn't a man folks noticed much, just another dusty rancher with a weather-beaten hat pulled low and eyes that carried a quiet weight. But Jed wasn't like most men you'd meet in a place like this. Underneath that rough exterior was a secret he kept close, one he'd buried deep for years. A mistake from long ago, something that still haunted the nights when the wind howled just right. He rode with a steady hand and a slow gait, but his heart carried a burden that made him wary of trusting anyone. Dry Creek was a town that thrived on shadows, the kind of place where smiles were often masks, and the law was more suggestion than rule. In the saloon, where the whiskey was strong and the promises weaker, people did their best to hide their true selves behind laughter and smoke. The world Jed stepped into wasn't black or white. It was the endless gray between. Men dealt in secrets and favors, and every handshake had an edge. It was a place where right and wrong twisted together, where survival meant choosing the lesser evil, and the price of a single decision could haunt a man forever. The air was thick with tension that evening, a quiet buzz beneath the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of voices. At the far end of the saloon, under the dim glow of a lantern, 3 young women sat on rough stools. Their dresses were worn, but their eyes held a fierce spark that didn't belong in a place like this. They were there not by choice, but by fate, a grim auction about to begin. The kind of auction that didn't leave much room for hope. Whispers spread fast, and Jed's gaze locked on them, feeling something stirred deep inside. He knew that look all too well, the kind of fear that doesn't scream but claws quietly at your soul. Yet even as he watched, Jed felt the pull of something darker beneath the surface. This wasn't just a simple auction. There were hidden hands moving, plans made in shadows, promises that would soon be broken. The 3 sisters were caught in a trap that ran deeper than anyone in the room guessed. And Jed, with his past heavy on his shoulders, sensed a storm coming, a betrayal that would rip through the town like wildfire. He didn't know yet who would be the first to fall, but he could feel the shifting tides. There was more at stake here than just the fate of those sisters. There was a reckoning waiting to unfold, one that would force Jed to confront the ghosts he'd long tried to leave behind. The saloon's doors slammed open with a harsh creak that cut through the low hum of voices, slicing the air like a warning. Jed Matthews stepped inside, the fading light behind him casting a long shadow across the warped floorboards. Dust clung to his boots like regret, thick and persistent, a reminder of every place he'd been and every line he'd crossed. His eyes, sharp from years of watching and waiting, swept over the room. It wasn't just about who was present. It was about what they were hiding. And in Dry Creek, everyone was hiding something. Amos Blake leaned against the bar, polishing a glass that didn't need cleaning, his crooked smile stretching just a little too wide. His cold, calculating gaze flicked up at Jed without surprise, like a chess player acknowledging a move he'd already anticipated. Amos didn't need muscle or violence to keep his grip on the town. His power lay in knowing everything before it happened, in whispers exchanged behind closed doors, in debts quietly collected, in secrets people would kill to protect. The saloon was a stage, and every soul inside danced to a tune he controlled with quiet, ruthless precision. But even Amos felt the tension tonight, a subtle shift in the air that he couldn't quite place, and that unsettled him more than he'd admit. May moved like smoke through the crowd, every step deliberate, every smile laced with something harder. She wore her beauty like armor, not invitation. Eyes followed her, but none truly saw her. She had once spoken to children about poetry and maps and hope, but life had redrawn her path in cruel ink. What remained was a woman honed by pain and hardened by necessity. And yet, behind that practiced gaze, something softer stirred. She glanced at the sisters, not out of pity, but out of a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. Their fate was tangled with hers in ways that kept her up at night. And though she told herself she'd cut all ties to the past, Dry Creek never truly let anyone go. Caleb Turner nursed a glass of something strong and bitter, seated near the corner as if trying to disappear into the walls. But the fire in his eyes betrayed him. He was a man fractured, forged in war, but broken by peace. The silence after battle had proved louder than the bullets ever were. His hands, scarred and calloused, clenched around his drink like it might steady the ghosts that followed him. May's glance lingered on him a second too long, and he felt it like a wound reopening. He didn't know if he hated her or needed her, perhaps both. The past between them was an unspoken thing, frayed by loss and guilt, and tonight it threatened to come undone. Caleb hadn't come to Dry Creek to be anyone's savior, but the weight of what was coming dragged him in all the same. The sisters sat close together, their silence loud in a room full of noise. Lila, the eldest, held her chin high, though her fingers trembled slightly where they clutched her skirt. The world had demanded too much from her too soon, and she had learned to meet cruelty with steel. Ruth's eyes drifted to the windows, as if she could will the desert to open a path to escape. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were dipped in dreams, dangerous things in a place like this. Grace, the youngest, barely met anyone's eyes. She flinched at sudden sounds, her body curled into itself as though trying to disappear. But even in her quietness, there was strength, a stubborn ember that hadn't yet gone out. Together, they were the kindling to a fire no one fully understood. As the night deepened, the saloon thickened with more than just smoke. Conversations dropped to hushed tones. Cards were dealt with more caution, and Amos's attention shifted to the far corner where Jed noticed a man who hadn't been there moments ago. Cole. The name moved through the town like a warning, though few had seen him in the flesh. His presence now was no accident. He didn't play games, he played outcomes. Cole's movements were fluid, too precise to be anything but dangerous, and the flash of steel beneath his coat was no idle threat. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't chance, and it wasn't mercy. He was here for something, and that something was about to tip the scales in a town already teetering on the edge. May's path through the saloon wavered just slightly when she passed Caleb. He noticed. Everyone did. Their history hung in the air like smoke. Visible, choking, impossible to ignore. Caleb's gaze followed her, full of things unsaid, the space between them aching with unfinished sentences. May wasn't the type to gamble on feelings, especially not now. But the choices looming over her were growing fewer, and every glance at the sisters made her question how far she'd go to survive, and what part of herself she might lose in the process. Every movement in the saloon began to feel calculated. Every smile had teeth. Amos stood straighter, his control tested not by a single threat, but by the convergence of many. The auction loomed, but it was no longer just about money. It was a battle for dominance, an unspoken war playing out in polite nods and veiled threats. Caleb's past wasn't buried as deep as he thought, and its roots were winding their way into the sisters' future. May walked the line between self-preservation and redemption, unsure which one would destroy her first. Cole, ever the predator, saw opportunity in chaos, and chaos was coming. And Jed, still as a coiled spring, watched it all. He saw the patterns forming, the fault lines deepening beneath the surface. Dry Creek had always been cruel, but tonight it felt cursed. The wrong word, the wrong glance could shatter everything. He didn't trust Amos, didn't understand Cole, and couldn't predict Caleb. May was a mystery he didn't want to solve, and the sisters, God help them, were lightning rods in a storm that had been gathering for years. Jed knew one thing. When the dust finally settled, no one in that saloon would be the same, and some might not walk out at all. The night in Dry Creek stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had turned to smoke and silence. Inside the saloon, the weight of unspoken fears and fragile hopes pressed down like a storm waiting to break. Time seemed suspended, each tick of the clock slow and deliberate, echoing like footsteps in a haunted house. Yet beneath that tension, something began to stir, quiet and tentative. It wasn't peace and it wasn't safety, but it was something close to connection, raw, imperfect, and desperately human. Jed Matthews felt the shift before he could name it. The longer he sat with the three sisters, the more he noticed the details that others overlooked. The quiet strength in Lila's silence, the flicker of steel in Ruth's voice, and the way Grace clutched her hands together, as if holding back a scream the world wouldn't understand. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, yes, but also the grit. They weren't just surviving, they were enduring. And slowly, brick by brick, the walls Jed had spent years building around his own soul began to crumble. In those dim corners of the saloon, between candle shadows and hushed confessions, Jed shared slivers of himself. Nothing dramatic, just enough to crack the surface. A name, a loss, a failure he still wore like a second skin. And the sisters listened, not with judgment, not with pity, but with the kind of quiet empathy that reminded Jed of something he'd forgotten. People could still care, even in a place like Dry Creek. May, ever guarded and sharp, found herself drawn into the quiet orbit of this fragile trust. She moved slower now, less like a strategist scanning the board, and more like someone who'd momentarily set her sword aside. The cracks in her armor showed in flickers, glances that lingered too long, words that faltered when she meant to be strong. With Caleb, those cracks widened. She let him see behind her careful composure, the grief she carried like a wound, the mistakes she could never undo. Caleb, too, bore the strain. His hands, once steady in war, trembled now under the weight of memory. The ghosts he carried whispered to him in every silence, telling him he would fail again. But in the presence of May's pain, he saw his own reflected, and something inside him refused to surrender to it. The bond between the sisters and Jed deepened not with grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces, a shared glance across the room, the soft brush of fingers as a drink was passed, the brief, broken smiles that spoke louder than words. Ruth, who once dreamed in secret, now spoke aloud of those dreams, of skies without dust, of freedom that didn't come with a price. Grace, tremulous but fierce, unveiled the truth behind her silence, a story no one should carry, but she did. And Lila, battle-hardened and weary, clung to her role as protector with the desperation of someone who knew what it meant to lose everything. But hope, once born, is not immune to fear. The deeper their connection grew, the darker the shadows loomed. Amos Blake's eyes lingered too long on the sisters, his smirk carrying the promise of cruelty cloaked in charm. The auction's approach twisted the air tighter, turning every conversation into a gamble, every moment into a test. Cole's silence grew sharper, like a blade waiting for the right moment to strike. His presence was a cold pressure, a reminder that danger didn't always come loud. It often moved in stillness, waiting for the right crack to break through. Caleb's past and present waged war inside him. The part of him that once believed in justice found itself shackled by the weight of loss. And May's nearness made every choice harder, every emotion more dangerous. She wanted to believe in him. God knew she did. But the past had taught her too, well, how quickly trust could be weaponized. And yet, they gravitated toward each other like gravity refused to let them go, even if both feared the collision. Jed, for all his strength, felt the pull of his own ghost tightening around his throat. What he had done, or failed to do, still clung to him, a wound that hadn't scabbed over. But the sisters gave him something unexpected, a reason to keep trying. A reason to believe that maybe redemption wasn't a myth. That maybe, just maybe, Even men like him had a second chance waiting at the end of a long road. Still, the stakes were rising. The auction would soon demand blood, and the ground beneath him trembled with all the truths no one dared say aloud. Trust had become more than fragile. It had become dangerous. Every thread they'd woven could unravel in a second, torn apart by ambition, betrayal, or fear. They all knew it, but none of them could stop. Not now. Not when the cost of walking away might be worse than the fight. As night crept closer to dawn, and the saloon's oil lamps flickered against the gray light of morning, the weight of everything they had shared settled like dust on the wooden floor. Jed stood near the window, watching the first streaks of sun pierce the darkness, and he knew none of them would leave this day unchanged. Choices would be made, lines would be crossed, and what survived the morning light would not be innocence, but something harder, something earned, something forged in the fire of Dry Creek. The dawn's pale light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the saloon, casting long, shaky shadows over faces drawn tight with worry and fatigue. Dry Creek had never felt so heavy, so charged with the weight of what was to come. Jed Matthews sat near the worn bar, the bitter taste of old whiskey lingering on his tongue as his thoughts spiraled deeper into the tangled mess around him. The auction was no longer a distant threat, but an inevitable storm closing in fast, and the fragile alliances that had formed in the night now felt like a house built on shifting sand. Everyone here was fighting their own battles, both inside and out, and the walls were closing in. The first blow came with brutal suddenness. Amos Blake, the saloon's cold-hearted owner, had made a move no one saw coming. He summoned the sheriff, an unyielding man whose loyalty lay not with justice, but with whoever paid the most, and spread word that Jed was stirring trouble, threatening the delicate balance Amos had worked years to build. Jed's past, once buried, was now dragged out in the open, twisted into a weapon meant to discredit him. Whispers turned to pointed fingers, and the quiet trust the sisters had placed in him began to crack. Jed felt the sting of betrayal, the raw wound of old sins reopening, and he realized the fight for the sisters' freedom was no longer just about their bodies. It was about their very souls. For the sisters, the setbacks cut deeper than any thread of sail or chains. Grace's secret, long hidden in the shadows of shame and fear, was cruelly exposed by a drunken patron who sought to claim power by tearing down what little dignity she had left. The saloon went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into murmurs and stares that burned like fire. Grace retreated into herself, the fragile hope she had clung to slipping further from reach. Lila tried to shield her youngest sister, but even her fierce determination faltered under the weight of the town's cruelty. Ruth's dreams of escape now seemed like a cruel joke, a fantasy that mocked the harsh reality closing in around them. May's internal battle reached a breaking point. Torn between loyalty to the sisters and the harsh demands of survival in Dry Creek, she faced a choice that threatened to shatter everything she had built. When Amos tightened his grip, threatening to ruin her livelihood if she didn't toe the line, May's resolve wavered. Her past whispered warnings of loss and pain, and for the first time, she doubted whether she could stand strong against the rising tide of corruption. Caleb, too, wrestled with his demons. His protective instincts warred against the memories of violence and failure that haunted him. When a confrontation with Cole turned violent, Caleb's old wounds reopened, and the man who had tried to bury his past found himself staring into the abyss once more. The external obstacles piled on relentlessly. The town's few allies vanished one by one, scared off by threats or bought with promises. Even the sheriff, supposed to be the law, acted more like Amos's puppet than a man of justice. The sisters were left increasingly isolated, their fate slipping through their fingers like dry sand. The auction's date drew closer, and the stakes soared higher than anyone could have imagined. It was no longer just about escape or survival. It was about reclaiming humanity in a place that seemed determined to strip it away. Jed's secret, the flaw he had tried to hide, became a burden heavier than ever. It wasn't just the past mistake. Now, it was the knowledge that he might have to sacrifice himself to save the sisters, to stand as a shield against the darkness closing in. The psychological toll weighed on him, the crushing pressure threatening to break the fragile strength he'd gathered. His moments of doubt grew longer, his confidence thinner. Yet beneath the despair, a stubborn ember burned. Jed knew that surrender wasn't an option, not when lives depended on him, and not when redemption was still possible, however distant. The tension within the saloon reached a breaking point one night when a fight erupted, raw, desperate, and messy. Caleb and Cole came to blows, a brutal clash of old scores and clashing wills that left the room trembling. The fight wasn't just physical. It was the eruption of all the hidden fears, regrets, and anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. May's cries echoed in the chaos, a raw plea for peace that seemed to fall on deaf ears. The sisters huddled together, each grappling with their own terror and heartbreak as the world around them spiraled into chaos. Through all the turmoil, moments of humanity flickered briefly like stars in a dark sky. Jed found himself holding Ruth's hand, steadying her trembling body as she fought back tears. Lila's fierce protectiveness softened when she saw Caleb's broken spirit, recognizing a kindred soul lost in his own war. Grace's quiet strength, though battered, began to surface again, fueled by the small kindnesses that reminded her she was not alone. These moments, fragile as they were, became the threads holding the group together amid the growing storm. But the clock was ticking, and the auction loomed closer with each passing hour. The setbacks, the betrayals, and the weight of their own fears pushed the characters to their limits. The emotional drama swelled, raw and unfiltered, as they faced a future that seemed darker than any of them had imagined. The fight for freedom was no longer just a struggle against others. It was a battle within themselves, a test of their courage, hope, and the very strength of their spirits. The moment Jed Matthews had been running from for years finally caught up to him in the cold light of that grim morning. The auction was to begin by noon, and the saloon was packed with faces twisted by greed, cruelty, and cold calculation. But inside Jed, a storm was raging louder than the dust whipping through the empty streets outside. His past, the dark secret he had carried like a wound that never healed, loomed large and unrelenting. Every step he took toward the saloon doors felt heavier, as if the ghosts of his past were chained to his boots, dragging him back to a place he'd sworn never to return. Jed's flaw wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal, one that shattered someone he once loved and had haunted him with guilt ever since. That past wasn't something he could bury anymore. It demanded to be faced, and the sisters' fight for freedom was bound tightly to his own reckoning. As the crowd inside the saloon waited, buzzing with anticipation, Jed took a deep breath and stepped inside, the creak of the old wooden floor echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. The auctioneer's voice cut through the room, but Jed's attention was fixed on the three sisters, Lila, Ruth, and Grace, whose eyes met his with a mixture of fear and hope. He saw in them the reflection of his own pain, and something fierce ignited in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, about fighting back against a past that threatened to consume them all. Jed moved forward, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion as he challenged Amos Blake's authority, calling out the injustice and cruelty that had poisoned Dry Creek. The confrontation that followed was like lightning tearing through a storm. Amos sneered, his calm facade cracking as he accused Jed of stirring trouble, of being a dangerous outsider who didn't belong. But Jed was no longer the man who hid in the shadows. He spoke of the sisters' worth, of the humanity too long denied them, and with every word, The room shifted. Cole stepped forward, his cold smile faltering as the truth Jed laid bare cut through the lies like a blade. The crowd's murmur grew into a roar. Not all were ready to follow Jed, but the seed of doubt had been planted. In the heat of that moment, Jed's own fears and vulnerabilities spilled out. He told the story he had buried for so long, the mistake that cost him everything, the guilt that had shaped his every step. It was a confession that stripped away the last layers of his armor, revealing a man broken but willing to fight for a chance at healing. The sisters, too, share their pain. Grace spoke softly but with a strength that stunned the room, naming the abuse she had endured and the shame she had carried alone. Ruth and Lila added their voices, their stories weaving together into a tapestry of sorrow, resilience, and hope. May and Caleb, standing nearby, felt the weight of their own battles shift as well. May's hard-won walls crumbled, and she admitted the fears that had kept her silent, the love and loyalty that had complicated every choice. Caleb's stoic facade cracked as he revealed the scars of war and loss, the guilt that made him doubt his worth. In that room, where cruelty had ruled for so long, raw humanity was breaking through, piercing the darkness with flickers of light. The tension didn't disappear. It boiled over into a chaotic storm. Voices clashed, threats flew, and the fragile bond seemed ready to snap. But Jed stood firm, a beacon in the chaos. The sisters' faces full of trembling hope gave him strength. As the crowd surged, Caleb and Cole faced off once more. But this time Caleb's resolve was unshakable. May moved among the people, her voice rising with passion, calling for justice and mercy in a way that surprised even herself. Slowly, the tide turned. Some in the crowd began to question the cruelty they had accepted for too long. The sheriff, seeing the shifting mood, hesitated instead of enforcing Amos's will. Amos, his power waning, lashed out in desperation but found fewer willing to back him. Jed's past no longer held him prisoner. It had become the fuel for his fight. The sisters' dignity, once threatened with destruction, began to reclaim its place in the hearts of those who listened. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the conflict reached its peak. Jed and Amos faced each other across the room, the old wounds and new battles mirrored in their eyes. Jed's voice was steady, filled with the weight of all he'd endured and all he refused to lose. Amos's rage was fierce but hollow, the crumbling of his control evident to all. In that moment, Jed made a choice, not just to fight for the sisters, but to finally forgive himself. It was a breakthrough that changed everything. The shift toward resolution wasn't easy or clean. There were wounds that would take time to heal and scars that would never fully fade. But the battle was won, at least for now. The sisters were safe from the auction's cruel hand. The town's grip loosened, and Jed's burden lightened by the first true step toward freedom. In the quiet that followed, the small circle that had formed in the saloon, Jed, the sisters, May, Caleb, felt something new, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, a better life was possible. The road ahead was uncertain and hard, but for the first time in years, Jed Matthews looked toward it without fear. The past had met its reckoning, and with it came the chance to rebuild, not just the lives of those caught in Dry Creek's harsh grasp, but his own shattered soul. The early morning light seeped softly into the small room where Jed Matthews sat with the three sisters, their faces still tired but marked with a fragile peace. The storm that had raged through Dry Creek, tearing at their lives and spirits, had finally quieted. But the wounds, deep and raw, still lingered, a reminder of the battles fought and the sacrifices made. Jed looked at Lila, Ruth, and Grace and saw more than the frightened women who had been auctioned like cattle. He saw survivors, women beginning to reclaim their lives with a quiet, stubborn strength. Healing wouldn't come quickly, nor would it be free of setbacks, but the first steps had been taken. Jed's own heart bore scars too, but the weight on his chest had eased. The confrontation that had brought his past into the light did more than unsettle Dry Creek's cruel order. It forced him to face himself, to begin forgiving the man he had been and the man he could still become. He wasn't whole yet, but in this new dawn, there was room to try. He reached out to Ruth, whose hands trembled as she held a worn locket. Her mother's, passed down like a silent promise that even in the darkest times, love endured. The simple gesture spoke volumes, a symbol of connection that stretched beyond words. May, who had been a reluctant ally, now moved among the sisters with a softer step and a gentler voice. She had carried her own burdens for too long, and in this fragile new beginning, she allowed herself to hope. Her friendship with Caleb deepened, built on shared pain and the quiet understanding that neither had to face the future alone. Caleb, once a man hardened by war and loss, began to open, his eyes no longer clouded with defeat, but shining with something like purpose. Together, they began to imagine a life beyond Dry Creek, one where scars might heal and trust could grow. The town itself, scarred by years of injustice, started to change slowly. The sheriff, once Amos Blake's puppet, found a conscience stirred by the upheaval and the courage of those who had stood against cruelty. Small acts of kindness appeared in the dusty streets. A neighbor sharing bread, a shopkeeper offering work, voices speaking out where silence had once ruled. It wasn't a fairy tale, and old wounds didn't vanish overnight, but a new thread was woven into the fabric of the community, a thread of hope and a tentative promise of better days. Jed watched as Lila tended a small garden behind the saloon, her hands coaxing life from the dry earth. It was a simple act, but profoundly symbolic, a gesture of growth and renewal after the harsh drought of suffering. Ruth helped Grace take slow steps outside, the youngest sister's eyes wide with cautious wonder at the world beyond the saloon shadows. These moments, quiet and unremarkable to an outsider, were victories born of courage and love. Jed and the sisters had come through hell, but their journey was far from over. They carried the past with them, the memories of pain and loss etched into their souls, but those memories no longer chained them. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength it took to survive and the hope that had not been extinguished. Jed's promise to protect and stand with them was not a vow made lightly. It was a commitment forged in fire and tempered by truth. As the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over Dry Creek, Jed and May stood side by side, watching the sisters laugh quietly around a small fire. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges and shadows, but beneath the open sky, there was peace. Not a perfect peace. Nothing in their lives had ever been perfect, but a peace born from facing the darkest night and finding the courage to greet the dawn. This was not the end of their story, but a new beginning, marked by love, acceptance, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving the worst and still choosing to hope.